today we are diving deep into some seriously existential waters. We're talking about free will. That age-old question. Do we really have it? Or is it all just a big, beautiful illusion?
And to help us unravel this tricky subject, we've got Robert Sapolsky's book, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will, as our guide.
This book, it really throws down the gauntlet, doesn't it? Makes you question everything you thought you knew about choice and, well, about being human.
Sapolsky, he's a renowned neurobiologist, and let me tell you, he presents a pretty compelling argument against the whole free will idea. And some of his arguments, well, they might leave you feeling a little bit like the rug's been pulled out from under you.
So before we get in too deep, maybe what's the core of Sapolsky's argument?
He uses this metaphor, it's really catchy, turtles all the way down. Basically what he's saying is that every single thing we do, every thought we have, every decision, you can trace it back to some endless chain of causes and influences.
Okay, so no magical starting point, no uncaused cause, as he puts it, just like an infinite chain of things that make us do what we do.
Exactly.
It's a powerful image, right? But it kind of leaves you hanging. If it's not free will pulling our strings, then what is it? Like, where do we even begin to untangle all of this?
Well, a good place to start might be with Benjamin Libet. You familiar with Libet's experiment?
Something to do with the timing of brain activity and making decisions, right?
You got it. So Libet, he had people do this simple task, move their finger whenever they felt like it, super simple. But the whole time, he was monitoring their brain activity.
I'm already seeing where this is going.
And what he found was kind of freaky. There's this brain signal, the readiness potential, and it showed up before people were even aware of deciding to move their finger.
Whoa, hold on. So their brains were basically making the call before they even consciously thought about it. That's kind of creepy, isn't it?
Yeah, a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Definitely challenges our sense of being in control. Like, are we really calling the shots?
But I'm guessing there's got to be some pushback on this, right? Moving your finger, that doesn't exactly scream complex.
You're right. There's been tons of debate on whether this simple finger-moving thing actually captures, the essence of free will. Choosing a career path, who to marry, that's way more complicated than just, hey, finger, move.
Right. Those are big decisions, not exactly the same playing field.
Yeah, totally. And then there's this whole other line of research on what they call free won't. Basically, it's our ability to say nope to an action, to hit the brakes, inhibit an impulse.
Free won't. So, like, even if we don't get to choose what we want, maybe we get to veto it.
Kind of. And it's interesting, the same brain regions that light up when we decide to do something, they also light up when we decide not to do it.
Okay. But the big question still remains. Where do those initial impulses, the urges to act or not act, where do they come from?
Exactly. And Sapolsky, his point is, regardless of when our brains light up or when we become consciously aware, the key is figuring out why we form certain intentions in the first place. What pushes us down one path or another?
The why question. That seems to be at the heart of everything here. He doesn't stop at, like, brain scans and finger twitches, does he? It feels like he's taking us much deeper, like peeling back all these layers of influence on our choices.
You're absolutely right. He doesn't stop there. He starts with the most immediate stuff.
Yeah.
What happens seconds or minutes before a choice? Think about sensory info, even subliminal stuff, things we're not even aware of. They can have a crazy impact.
Oh, this reminds me of that study where, like, people who did something kind of shady, morally questionable, they were way more likely to wash their hands afterwards. Like trying to wash away the guilt, literally.
That's it. That's a classic example. It's even got a name, the Macbeth effect. Like Lady Macbeth, obsessively washing our hands. Our brains are like sponges, soaking up all this information from everywhere, and it primes us to do things without us even realizing it.
So immediate surroundings matter, but knowing Sapolsky, he doesn't stop there. He probably zooms out even further, right?
Oh yeah, he definitely zooms out. He looks at things that play out over weeks, years, decades even. Hormones, neuroplasticity, how our experiences, especially during the teenage years, can actually rewire our brains.
The teenage brain, that's a whole other rabbit hole. What are some of the takeaways there about how those years shape our choices?
Well, adolescence, it's like prime time for the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that handles planning, impulse control, all the grown-up stuff. And during this time, experiences, good and bad, they really leave their mark.
So, like, a teenager who's dealing with tons of stress, their prefrontal cortex might not be as equipped to handle, impulsive stuff.
It's complicated, but yeah, the principle holds true. Those early experiences, especially rough ones, they can have long-term effects on how we regulate emotions, control impulses, all of that.
This makes me think about like poverty or childhood trauma. It's not just about the immediate hardship, it's how these experiences shape the very structure of the brain, right?
Absolutely. And then Sapolsky, he takes it even further back in time into the realm of genetics and cultural evolution.
Now we're talking. How does he connect individual choices to something as huge as cultural evolution?
He's saying that the kinds of societies our ancestors lived in, like were they individualistic or more community-oriented, that could have influenced which genes were passed down, genes that made people better suited to those specific environments. So over generations, those little genetic differences, they might have predisposed people to certain cultural values, certain ways of behaving.
Okay, so let me get this straight. If my ancestors were, say, nomadic herders who relied heavily on teamwork to survive, I might be genetically predisposed to like be more community-oriented, more cooperative.
Yeah, it's always a complex interplay of genes and environment, but the idea is that our genes don't just determine how we look, they can also influence, how we behave in social situations, our values, all that.
It's like free will is getting squeezed from every direction here. Our genes, our brains, our environment, it's all playing a part. But surely there's got to be some wiggle room, right? Even if our genes and early experiences influence us, we can still make choices about who we want to become, can't we?
That's what Sapolsky calls the free will loophole.
Hmm.
It's a popular objection. And he tackles it head on with this really interesting example of two baboons. These two baboons, they were named Cato and Finn, both strong, capable guys, but their lives, they took totally different paths. Cato, he climbed the baboon social ladder, made strong alliances, really thrived.
Hmm.
Finn, on the other hand, he just kept missing the boat, alienating other baboons, ended up stuck at the bottom.
Sounds like classic personality differences, right? Or maybe like Finn just made some bad choices along the way.
That's what you'd think, right? But Sapolsky, he digs deeper and finds this key difference in their early lives. Turns out, Finn had a really rough childhood, tons of stress, while Cato, he had it relatively easy.
Ah, so this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Those early experiences, especially stressful ones, they can have a lasting impact on brain development.
Exactly. And specifically, the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain responsible for self-control, decision-making, all the stuff that helps us navigate social situations. Sapolsky's saying that Finn's tough early years, they probably shaped his brain in a way that made him less socially adept, less able to control his impulses.
So hold on, are you saying that even what we think of as personality, like those deep-seated parts of who we are, those could actually be traced back to early experiences, things we had absolutely no control over?
That's what Sapolsky's proposing. It's kind of a mind-blowing idea, right? Because we tend to think of our personalities as fixed, like this is who I am, take it or leave it. But he's suggesting that even those core parts of ourselves, they're heavily influenced by our experiences, especially early on.
It's kind of a sobering thought, isn't it? It makes you think about the long-term impact of things like childhood trauma,
Right.
poverty, neglect. It's not just about overcoming hardship in the moment. It's about how those experiences literally shape the structure and function of our brains, influencing us for years to come.
It's huge, and it challenges a lot of our assumptions about personal responsibility. Like, how much control do we really have? Sapolsky, he's not saying we're just robots programmed by our past, though. He acknowledges that our brains are amazingly adaptable, that we can grow and change.
Yeah.
But even that capacity for change, it's influenced by things we didn't choose.
This brings us back to that free will loophole idea, right? Like,
Yeah.
sure, genes and experiences matter, but don't we still have the power to choose how we respond to those influences? Can't we overcome our past and make different choices in the present?
That's a question a lot of people struggle with. It's where Sapolsky introduces this idea of earned free will. He's saying that our ability to make conscious, deliberate choices, it's not something we're just born with. It's something we develop over time, and it's heavily influenced by the environments we're exposed to, the opportunities we have.
So someone who grows up in a really supportive environment with good education, chances for personal growth, they're more likely to develop that capacity for making conscious choices.
Yeah.
Compared to someone who's, say, constantly struggling to survive, dealing with poverty or trauma.
Exactly. Sapolsky's point is that free will, this ability to make choices that align with our values and goals, it's not some magical gift given to everyone equally. It's a capacity that's nurtured, cultivated. And unfortunately, a lot of people are denied the conditions they need to develop that capacity.
It's almost like if you're lucky enough to grow up in an environment that supports self-control, rational decision-making, a strong sense of agency, then you're more likely to make choices that reinforce those qualities. But if you're deprived of those opportunities, if your brain is shaped by stress and adversity, then it becomes that much harder to exercise that kind of conscious choice.
It's a complex issue, and it really forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we think about personal responsibility. It's not about letting people off the hook or saying that their choices don't matter. It's about recognizing the profound impact of environment and acknowledging that not everyone has the same opportunities to develop the capacity for conscious, deliberate choice.
So how do we reconcile this idea with our deeply ingrained need for justice, for holding people accountable for their actions? If we're saying that free will is an illusion, does that mean we just throw out the whole concept of justice altogether?
That's a big question, and Sapolsky doesn't shy away from it. He's clear that letting go of the free will illusion doesn't mean abandoning accountability, but it does mean rethinking what accountability looks like. It means moving beyond a purely punitive model of justice, where the focus is on punishment and retribution, and towards a system that recognizes the complex interplay of factors that contribute to behavior.
So less about blame and punishment, more about understanding, rehabilitation, addressing those root causes that lead to harmful behavior.
Exactly. He actually points to the evolution of our understanding of epilepsy as a really powerful example of how shifting our perspective on behavior can lead to more humane and effective responses.
Epilepsy, how does that fit in here?
Well, think about it. Centuries ago, epilepsy was seen as like demonic possession, right? A sign of moral weakness or spiritual corruption. People with epilepsy were ostracized, feared, subjected to all sorts of horrible treatments.
Yeah, that's a pretty dark chapter in human history. Not exactly a compassionate approach.
Definitely not. But then as we started to understand the biological basis of epilepsy, that it's a neurological disorder, not some moral failing, our attitudes completely shifted. We moved away from blame and towards compassion, replacing those harmful treatments with medication and therapy.
So science basically helped us destigmatize a condition that was once seen as like a sign of evil or weakness. We recognized that people with epilepsy weren't bad people, they were just dealing with a medical condition that required treatment and support.
Exactly. And Sapolsky's argument is that we can apply this same kind of thinking to other behaviors, even criminal behavior. As we learn more about the brain, about the interplay of genes and environment, we can develop a more nuanced understanding of why people do the things they do. And that understanding can lead to more effective and compassionate interventions, a system of accountability that's actually focused on rehabilitation and restoration, not just punishment.
It's a big shift in perspective, but it's a hopeful one, isn't it? Instead of just locking people up and throwing away the key, we can focus on addressing those underlying causes, helping people change their behavior and become contributing members of society.
It's definitely a more humane approach. And Sapolsky argues that it's not about being soft on crime or ignoring the harm that's been done. It's about recognizing the complexity of human behavior and creating a system of justice that reflects that complexity.
So, while accepting that free will might be an illusion can feel kind of unsettling, maybe even a bit scary, Sapolsky is suggesting that it can actually lead to a more compassionate and just world. It's a fascinating paradox.
Absolutely. And it challenges us to really rethink some of our most basic assumptions about choice, responsibility, and the very nature of what it means to be human.
He doesn't stop there, though, does he? There's this whole other layer to his argument, this idea of emergent complexity. Now, that one really makes my head spin a bit.
Ah, yes, emerging complexity. It's a mind bender, for sure. But it's a crucial part of his argument against free will. Basically, it refers to the phenomenon where simple components, following basic rules, can interact in ways that create incredibly complex and often unpredictable patterns of behavior.
Okay, give me an example, because right now it's all a bit abstract.
Think about a flock of birds, how they fly in those amazing synchronized formations. Each individual bird is just following simple rules, like staying a certain distance from its neighbors, avoiding obstacles. But when you put thousands of birds together, all following those same simple rules, you get this incredibly complex, beautiful, and seemingly coordinated behavior.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So you're saying that proponents of free will might argue that consciousness, our sense of self, our ability to make choices, maybe that arises from the incredible complexity of the human brain in a similar way. Like billions of neurons interacting create this sense of me that can make free, independent choices.
You got it. That's the gist of their argument. But Sapolsky, he doesn't buy it. He argues that emergent complexity, while fascinating, doesn't necessarily imply free will or conscious agency. He points to a bunch of examples where you see complex, seemingly intelligent behavior in systems that clearly don't have free will.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of examples are we talking about? Because if you're telling me that my brain is basically a flock of birds, I'm gonna need some convincing.
Fair enough. One of his favorite examples is slime molds. These are single-celled organisms, no brain, no nervous system, but they can do some pretty amazing things. They can solve mazes, find the most efficient path to a food source, and even exhibit a kind of memory.
You're telling me these little blobs of goo can solve mazes. How is that even possible?
It's pretty wild, right? But the key is that their behavior, while it seems intelligent and purposeful, is actually driven by simple chemical signals and responses to their environment. They're basically operating on autopilot, responding to cues in a predictable, deterministic way. No conscious decision-making required.
Okay, I'm starting to see the point here. Complexity doesn't automatically equal free will. Just because something seems intelligent or purposeful doesn't mean there's a little me inside calling the shots.
Exactly. And Sapolsky, he goes on to talk about ant colonies, another great example of emergent complexity. Individual ants, they follow these really simple rules based on scent trails and chemical signals. But collectively, those simple rules give rise to all sorts of complex behaviors, foraging for food, building intricate nests, waging war against other colonies.
It's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, but again, no free will involved, right?
Right. And this brings us back to the human brain. Sapolsky argues that even the development of our nervous system, this incredibly complex network of billions of neurons, it all unfolds according to deterministic principles. It's guided by things like chemical gradients, genetic instructions, simple rules of attraction and repulsion between cells.
So, while the end product, the human brain, is mind-blowingly complex, the process that creates it is still governed by predictable, deterministic mechanisms.
Exactly. And just as the complexity of a flock of birds or an ant colony doesn't necessarily imply free will, the complexity of the human brain, while amazing, doesn't automatically mean that we're consciously choosing our thoughts and actions.
It's like, no matter where we look, whether it's slime molds or ant colonies or even our own brains, this idea of free will just doesn't seem to hold up. Sapolsky has really shut down all the usual arguments.
He's pretty thorough, right?
Yeah.
But there's one last bastion of hope for the free will proponents.
Yes. The wild world of quantum mechanics. The idea that maybe, just maybe, the inherent randomness of the quantum world could be the source of our free will. It's a tempting thought.
It is tempting, especially when you consider how strange and unpredictable the quantum world is. Like if the subatomic world is fundamentally probabilistic, maybe that randomness somehow translates to our conscious decision-making.
So you're saying our thoughts are like tiny quantum particles flipping coins, randomly deciding what we're going to think and do next.
That's the hope, anyway. But Sapolsky, he lays out a few reasons why this whole quantum free will idea doesn't really hold water. For starters, quantum randomness, it's not really the same as the kind of deliberate, meaningful choice we associate with free will. It's not like these particles are thinking things over and making rational decisions. It's just pure chance, pure probability.
So it's not like those quantum particles have suddenly developed consciousness and are making choices. It's just inherent randomness in the system.
Exactly. And the other problem is, even if quantum effects do happen in the brain, it's really unlikely they have any significant influence on our behavior. The brain is a warm, wet, messy place, and quantum effects, they're super delicate. They tend to get drowned out by all the noise and complexity of neural activity.
So you're saying our brains are just too messy and chaotic for these little quantum fluctuations to be the driving force behind our decisions.
That's the idea. Our brains operate on a whole different level of organization. And while quantum mechanics is super important for understanding the fundamental building blocks of the universe, it doesn't really explain how our thoughts and behaviors emerge.
Okay, I think I'm finally starting to grasp the big picture here. Sapolsky has systematically dismantled the arguments for free will from every angle. No uncaused cause, no loophole through complexity, no quantum magic. But this leaves us with a pretty unsettling question. If we don't have free will, what does that even mean for us? How are we supposed to live in a world where our choices are essentially predetermined? It's a lot to wrap your head around, right? It makes you question some pretty fundamental stuff about choice and responsibility. Like, if we're essentially products of our biology and environment, does that mean we're off the hook for our actions?
That's where things get really interesting. And Sapolsky, he doesn't shy away from tackling these tough questions. He acknowledges that, yeah, it can be uncomfortable accepting this deterministic worldview. But he argues that the real danger isn't in accepting that we lack free will, it's in clinging to the illusion that we have it.
So you're saying that believing in free will is actually more harmful than accepting that it doesn't exist? How so?
Sapolsky's point is that this illusion of free will, it leads us to judge other people way too harshly. We forget about all those complex influences that shape their behavior. It's like we're saying, well, they could have just chosen differently, but we're not acknowledging all those factors that might have limited their choices or shaped their decision making?
It's like we're creating this system of judgment that's completely blind to the realities of human experience. We blame people for circumstances they couldn't control, poverty trauma, lack of education, even just plain bad luck. We don't factor those things in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that kind of thinking, it can have some serious consequences, especially when you look at our justice system. It leads to this huge emphasis on punishment instead of rehabilitation. We just keep perpetuating these cycles of harm, and we never really address those root causes of crime dysfunction.
So if we ditch this whole free will idea, does that mean we're saying that nobody's responsible for their actions? That we just give up on justice entirely?
Not at all. Sapolsky's very clear about this. Letting go of free will doesn't mean we throw accountability out the window. It just means we need to redefine what accountability looks like in a world where determinism is true.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we hold people accountable when we're acknowledging all these influences that are outside of their control?
It's about moving beyond this blame-centered model of justice.
Yeah.
The kind where it's all about punishment and retribution. And instead, we start focusing on understanding rehabilitation, addressing the root causes that lead to these harmful behaviors.
So less about punishment, more about understanding and helping people change.
He's not saying that we should just let people off the hook or excuse harmful behavior, but he's advocating for a justice system that's grounded in a realistic understanding of human behavior and that prioritizes rehabilitation and restoration over retribution.
It's a powerful idea. And even though accepting this deterministic view of the world might feel uncomfortable at first, Sapolsky suggests that it can actually pave the way for a more compassionate and just society. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. And it challenges us to re-examine some of our most basic assumptions about ourselves and the world around us, about choice responsibility, the essence of what it means to be human.
Sapolsky has given us a lot to think about, for sure. It's been a deep dive into some really complex questions about what it means to be human. But I think at the end of the day, his message is ultimately one of hope.
Absolutely. He's not denying that the world can be a difficult place, but he's reminding us that even in a world without free will, there's still room for compassion, for understanding, and for creating a more just and humane society.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of free will determinism and what it all means for how we understand ourselves and the world around us.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to check out Sapolsky's book, Determined for Yourself. It's a thought-provoking read that might just change the way you see the world. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.